Hello, everyone. This is Rick, and you're listening to the Space City X Files podcast. Before we start the show, I'd like to say that this episode contains explicit material. It includes accounts of murder and rape of young children, and because of the nature of this program, it's not suitable for children. Even adults may have a hard time hearing about the case. Please use discretion when listening further. I would also like to add before we begin, the reason I chose to cover this case is not to give recognition in any way to the monster of this story, but to try and bring justice for the children that have still yet to be identified. I also hope to bring awareness to the fact that a book cannot be judged by its cover. In this case, a seemingly normal citizen was really a wolf in sheep's clothing. And hopefully recounting this case can prevent something so heinous from ever happening again. One more thing. I'd like to add that the law enforcement at this time completely failed these boys. And I hope to uncover the reason as to why this man was able to kill over 28 children before he was brought to his end. We have to protect our children. And the only way to do that is through awareness. And now we'll start the show. If you're still here after that intro, I'm happy you decided to hear this case out. I didn't mean to scare anyone away, but after doing the research on this one, it would be wrong of me to not properly prepare everyone for what's in store. As adults, I think we all moved past the time in which we believed a monster was lurking around every corner or underneath every bed just waiting to get us. Sure, the universe is vast and there's many things in this world that cannot be explained, but we find a way to assure ourselves that we're safe. And whether that's by religion or some other avenue, in the end, we make it work. But I think you can agree the thing in our world that poses the most danger at times can be another person. Yes, the real monsters can be our fellow human beings. And at times, they can cause more horror than any Hollywood producer could depict on the big screen. The monster we're talking about in this case terrorized in inner city Houston, Texas for 3 whole years. And in these 3 years, he was able to rape and murder over 28 young boys all around the same area. He was coined with the nickname the Pied Piper and the Candyman for the way he lured his victims to their awaiting death. This is the true monster, folks. And how did he amass so many victims out of the same area without being captured? What was the initiative of the local police department to investigate the count of missing children in that area? And to this day, who is the unidentified body that has yet to be claimed by their family? These are the questions we hope to answer. As a lifelong Houstonian and a father of 6, this case hits so very hard to home, and I hope this episode will inspire others to reinvestigate and bring closure to the family that never got theirs after all these years. Although throughout the podcast you may hear me refer to him as not so good name, this is the story of the monster Dean Corll and the Houston mass murders. For the purpose of it being important to understand the case, and only for that reason, let's profile Dean first. Dean Arnold Corll was born December 24th, 1939, in Fort Wayne, Indiana, to Emmy and Arnold Corll. He was the first of 2, his parents later having another boy, Stanley. Dean's home life seemed a little tumultuous. His parents were described as the father being strict, with the boy's mother being the natural protector. And just from experience in my life, I can see how that can cause clashes. That is when the parents don't agree on the discipline of the children. So ultimately, Emma and Arnold's course of marriage comes to an end in 1946. At that time, Dean would be 7 years old. Now, in research, Dean is described as an introvert. This may have been the effect of the recent divorce, but he's described as being really shy and rarely socialized with other children, but is said to show concern for the well-being of others. And that's according to Jack Olson's book called The Man with the Candy. And here's something else that's interesting, and it may not be related, but at the age of 7, the divorce would be happening, of course. Well, Dean unknowingly contracts rheumatic fever, which we'll call RF from now on. And rheumatic fever is an inflammatory disease that affects the heart, joints, skin, and brain. So Dean unknowingly has this disease, and it goes untreated until doctors discover a heart murmur in 1950. So that's 5 years later since the time he contracted it. I did a search and found if RF left untreated could cause a mental illness. According to a paper published to Psychiatry Online, Dr. Marcos Mercadante and his team did a study called The Psychiatric Symptoms of Rheumatic Fever. And in the case study with 20 children ranging from 5 to 15 years old with RF, and there was another 22 children with Sydenham's chorea, which is the late central nervous system expression of RF, and another 20 children with neither disease. It says they found children who had untreated RF and SC had a higher amount who were experiencing tic disorders, excessive compulsive disorder, ADHD, and major depressive disorder than the other kids who had neither diseases. The case study was over an 18-month period, and the link will be provided in the show notes for you to read up on. So you add the heart murmur and the divorce. Is it possible that this was the turning point for Dean? Well, even with this, we can't say confidently yes or no. So anyways, life goes on, and in 1950, Dean's parents, they remarry. It's not clear if this was a result from his illnesses, but the family's back together, and they moved to Pasadena, Texas, which is a suburb of Houston. And it's here that Dean's parents falls apart again. And in 1953, they divorced for the second time. Okay, fast forward from here, Dean stays in Texas till graduating high school in 1958 out of Vidor, Texas. They bounce around a bit from town to town, and his mom remarries a traveling clock salesman named Jake West and have a daughter named Joyce. Now living in Vidor with Jake, working the sales gig, it's here the family first starts making candy. So Jake's selling the candy, he's on the road, and it looks as though Houston is on his route, and it happens to be where most of the candy is being sold. So the family decides we're going to move to the Heights, which is an inner city neighborhood in Houston. And now, just for context here, the Heights in Houston now is like an upper class area. It's close to downtown, so people have a shorter commute to work. It's a neighborhood with smaller homes, but they're on the expensive side. And in that area, it's very popular with the nightlife scene. And however, as trendy as it appears today, people who are old enough to remember will say that there's a stigma left on the neighborhood. Okay, so Dean's life appears pretty normal so far, and there's not much left of significance for his childhood. He moves with his grandma for a while in Indiana to help her out from his mom's request. And while he's there, he has a short relationship with a girl who wanted to marry him, but he declines. And then in 1962, he returns to Houston after 2 years in Indiana, where he goes back to work at the family's candy store. It's 1963 comes, and Dean's mom divorces Jake West and opens her own candy shop. And she names it Corll Candy Company, And to me, that says something about her because she hadn't had the last name Corll since her divorce in 1953. So it's clear the mother loves her son, and it's possible, and she's possibly setting them up with a revenue source for their future. So it looks like she loves her boys, and although it's at this time that Dean possibly does something out of line for the first time, a young man who's working for the family at the candy shop comes to Emma and tells her that Dean made unwanted sexual advances towards him. And in response to the accusations, Emma fires the young man. And so you can look at this two ways. One, she possibly saved his life. Or two, she may have enabled Dean into thinking he could start formulating his plan and do it without recourse. The last significant fact about Dean's profile is that in 1964 he was drafted to the United States Army. He did his time in Fort Polk, Louisiana, Fort Benning, Georgia, and his last stop was Fort Hood, Texas. His military record shows that it was unblemished while he was in, but it just wasn't for him. And a quick sidebar, I myself am a veteran. I did my basic training in 2005 in Fort Sill, Oklahoma, and we all thought the Army was tough then. I can only imagine what basic training and duty stations were like in the 60s. If I had to guess, I would say it was much more strict, and that's putting it lightly. The military can be a rough place for people who have a hard time fitting in. And at the same time, there's some unsavory people that come through there that you'll be sharing a room with. Now, Dean applies for a hardship discharge and receives it. And he claims it's on the grounds that his family needs him to run the business back home. It's reported that after he's discharged, he confides to people close to him that it was at some point in the service he discovered that he was a homosexual and even had his first encounter there. Now, whether the encounter was voluntary was not determined or reported on. However, people close to Dean reported noticing changes in his demeanor when teenage boys would come around from that point on. And perhaps it's here where Dean decided to act on the plan he made before the service. And so now we have David Brooks entering the story. It's 1965, and the family business is seeing an increase in demand, so Dean moves Corll Candy Company to another location in the Heights off of 22nd Street. And wouldn't you know, it's directly across from an elementary school, of course. And so it's here that he's basically starting to groom these young men by giving them free candy, striking up relationships with them. He even employs a few and then installs a pool table in the candy shop's back warehouse, so the employees, which are teen boys and local boys, can have a place to come hang out. It's also here where he gains the name the Candyman and the Pied Piper, and just starts outright flirting with these young teenage boys while they work. Now, it was reported here that Jake West seen what was happening, and although he was not associated with the family anymore, he let Emma know how he felt about it, and that probably fell on deaf ears. So skip forward to 67, and Dean meets David Brooks. At that time, David was 12 years old and in the 6th grade, and Dean starts grooming the young man right away by buying him candy, giving him a place to hang out. And Brooks recalls in an interview that Dean was the only person to ever mock Brooks about his glasses. This, combined with all the other inappropriate gifts, slowly made Brooks, an impressionable child, drop his guard, of course, to where he starts to see Dean as a father figure, he says. I have to say at this point, it's obvious that Dean is likely the only adult to be around when all this is taking place. I mean, if there were adults around watching this happen, they would probably be guilty of negligence at the least. Dean would have been 28 years old at the time, and he's hanging around a bunch of 12-year-olds. And nobody found that odd, which is the crazy part. And this case mean, it really kind of hit me hard in this case. So, but people watch for the signs. I mean, the world hasn't gotten better since the 60s. It's got worse. If you see something out of place, say something, or even call the cops if you see red flags. And it's even more important to know the red flags. It's better to be wrong and everything be okay than to do nothing at all and someone loses their life. And this is ever so real in sex trafficking. And so some of these poor kids and women have been trafficked so long that they're basically conditioned to think that what's happening is normal. So keep your eyes open, folks. All right, let's go back to the story. So Brooks starts to see Dean as a father figure, and big surprise because he's spending most of his time there. It's at this point when Corll officially breaks the law, and he coerces the young man David Brooks into his sexual relationships by paying him and giving him gifts. And so it came to the point that when David needed anything, money or drugs, Dean would provide it for him. And David states he was only 12 years old when he started a sexual relationship with Dean. And so move forward 3 years now, 1970, David and Dean have been continuing their twisted relationship. Only David's parents decide to split up. All right, so he decides to drop out of high school and he moves with his mom in Beaumont. And so now he's still traveling back to Houston to see his dad, but while he's doing that, he's also staying at Dean's apartment. Eventually, he says he's there so much, he basically sees it as his second home. And now he's only 15 years old at this point. And this is where the story turns deadly here. Oh, and if you're wondering where Emma Joyce and Stanley are, 2 years before, in 1968, they moved away to Colorado after the candy shop went under. Now, there was no one to truly see what Dean was up to. But I have to say, though, that his mom had to have seen what he was doing in the year of 67 and 68. He was already showing signs of inappropriate behavior with the minors. And I wonder if that's the reason why she left Texas behind. And I'd like to add, too, that I think his mom knew exactly what was going on because a mother knows her son. I mean, she's the one that raised him. A mother can tell when her child is up to no good. And so I kind of feel like all of Dean's relatives knew he was not right. And in September 25 of 1970, Corll would kill his first known victim. A young man named Jeffrey Conan would meet his end at the hands of this pathetic excuse of a human being. Conan was a college freshman who was hitchhiking home from the University of Texas to his parents' house in Houston. It's not a very smart thing to do, but some would argue it was a different time back then. And anyways, being young and naive is no reason to have your life ended by a sadistic person. And it's approximately 6:15 when Conan's ride drops him off alone. He's likely talked into taking a lift home from Dean. He lived in apartments nearby. And that was the last time Jeffrey Conan would be seen alive. He was later exhumed from an unmarked grave in High Island Beach. He was found bound hand and foot and wrapped in plastic with a thin layer of lime on top. The autopsy report would find he was sexually assaulted and asphyxiated. Around this time, between the 25th of September to the end of October, David Brooks was on the way to Dean's apartment, and it wasn't out of the ordinary for him just to walk in. And only this time, when he does walk in unannounced, he finds Dean sexually assaulting two teenage boys who were strapped to the post of his bed. Startled by Brooks, Dean jumps up and yells, "Damn it, David, I'm just trying to have some fun." And Brooks stated that part in his confession. Dean apparently was so shaken by this that he offers to buy Brooks a brand new, whatever year model it was, green Corvette in return for silence. And we know now that he did deliver on that because Brooks did have a green Corvette. And I think it was a 68, I think, or something like that. Or 69. And it's at this point that he decides to make a deadly pact with Brooks. And his pact is bring me young, unsuspecting boys, and in return, I'll give you $200 for each one, he says. Now, Brooks, being a shitbag himself, takes the offer. Now, not only does Brooks take the offer, but the people he has in mind to bring over are his own friends. Sorry, Brooks, at this point you went from being an abused child to a murderer. It's worth noting that Dean didn't tell Brooks till a while later that the teens he had seen at the apartment that night had been murdered by him. On December 13th, 1970, Brooks would set his plan into action when he got two 14-year-old boys, James Glass and Danny Yates, away from a church function that was going on in the Heights. Glass had knew Brooks, so he kind of trusted him. And of course, when he's offered a place to hang out and get high, to him it was kind of a no-brainer. It was that point they got him back to Cole's apartment, and Corll sprung his trap. So they're doing drugs, coaxing them into trying some handcuffs, and then binding them and gagging them. Dean tied them up to his torture board, where he raped and strangled them to death. Afterward, he would dispose of their body at a boat storage he rented in Southwest Houston. 6 weeks later, on January 30th, 1971, Brooks and Corll would spring their trap again on two unsuspecting teenage brothers, Donald and Jerry Waldrop. Now, these boys, they had just been dropped off at a friend's house, and only to find out that their friends are not there. Well, their ride already left, so now they got to walk home. And it's when they're walking home that they run into Brooks and Corll, who convinced them to take a ride in the van. And it was later reported after this was all over and they were inspecting Corll's property, and they did take a look and inspect this van. And in this van, there's two big boxes with holes in them. So I'm thinking they were putting the victims or the hostages in there. And there was also many tie-off points where you can tie somebody up to all along the van. There was so much rope, so much plastic in there. I mean, it was basically a murder van. He had it decked out as one. And so again, on March 9th, 1971, Brooks and Corll abducted and killed 15-year-old Randall Harvey, who was last seen by his parents riding away on his bike to a gas station where he worked. Then again, on March 29th, 1971, they abducted and killed David Hilligeist and Gregory Winkle. One 16 years old and the other was a 13-year-old. And I'd like to mention now that after the disappearance of Hilligeist, his family were putting up posters to try to find their son. Well, one of Hilligeist's best friends was a boy named Elmer Wayne Henley. And this young man would help them pass out posters. And this is an important name to the story, and we'll find out here shortly. So remember that name. And it's September 1971 now, so Corll moves into a new apartment complex in the Heights area. The name of those apartments are not listed, but it's here right away that he abducts, rapes, and murders two teens. And these teens' identities weren't discovered until later. One was not discovered at all. And we'll get to that young man at the end, and because we definitely want to bring awareness to that. And that's one of the main reasons why we're going over this case. It's certainly not to bring any unneeded attention to Corll, because he's dead and the world's a better place without him. So now enters Elmer Henley into the story. Now, Brooks and Elmer, they know each other because they used to hang around at school together. Brooks testifies that him and Elmer used to skip school together and get high and stuff. And so Brooks tells Elmer, "Hey, I want to introduce you to one of my friends." And it was likely Henley was to become another victim. However, for reasons unknown, Corll feels like Henley would make a better accomplice. And so he makes him to deal with the $200 also. It's here that he tells Henley for the first time also that he's part of a dark sex trafficking ring out of Dallas. But these statements can never be verified as true. And I don't think that they're verified as true because the local law enforcement at that time didn't want to put the work in to find it out. to put it bluntly. So I don't want to spiral here too much about something else, but something else is eating at me. Houston in 71, it wasn't a small town. Okay, it was already booming from oil, and the chemical refineries were already here. So with all these disappearances in a radius of less than 60 miles or so, how the hell did the police not catch wind of all this? I mean, why weren't they on the news saying that we got a serial murderer on the loose to keep your kids inside safe at home? How come a curfew was never implemented? Nothing was done, basically. And then comes this theory on Dean being involved in this intricate underground sex ring out of Dallas. Could it be there were larger agency powers at play? For example, possibly the FBI. They've been known on a few cases to let small fish walk in order to catch the big fish. I mean, hopefully the lives of 28 teenagers, or possibly more, wasn't the result of them wanting to catch the right guy. I mean, God, I hope not. Picking up back after Henley was propositioned to help Corll. So Henley says he initially ignores the Corll's deal, but he remains in contact with them. And then he even states that he starts to confide in him and see him as a brother figure. And with that right there, it's like, what the hell is wrong with these people at this time? Like, I mean, why would they see somebody like this as a brother figure to begin with? And so you can see that obviously there's something wrong with that young man. He's got issues as it is. So fast forward a bit to February 1972. This is 5 months after Corll's last known murder. Henley then decides to take Corll's offer. And so he states because his family fell on hard times. That's his explanation. And so it's like, never mind getting a job like a normal person. He decides he's going to help a perverted psychopath hurt people. And it would be approximately the 25th of that month that he follows through. So Henley and Corll, they go out and they find a young man at the corner of 11th and Studewood, which was only about 3 miles away from Corll's new residence located at 925 Schuler Street. The trap that they used was the same when Brooks and Corll were together. So, of course, they lured the boy into the car with the promise they were going to go smoke some weed at Corll's house. And there Henley would put cuffs on but have a key in his back pocket to make it look as though he could escape them. And after that, then it was the other boy's turn to try it on, only to realize, oh crap, I can't get free. At that point, Henley would leave Corll alone with the boys, but although he didn't see the murder, he did witness Corll gag and bind the young man hand and foot. And so the identity of the young man, or where his remains are, went unsolved for a long while too. But they did solve the identity of those young boys. And so at that point, Corll committed 10 murders. And so it's now March 24th, 1972, and it's Henley, Brooks, and Corll. Now all three of them are on the hunt. And they come across an acquaintance of Henley's, an 18-year-old young man named Frank Aguirre. And per the usual, Henley gets Frank to come with them with the promise of beer and weed. Only in this case, Henley states that he didn't expect Corll to want Frank as a victim. So the four of them are in the apartment. They're all smoking and drinking. And Aguirre sees some handcuffs laying on the table. Well, I mean, unbeknownst to him that he was in the presence of a psycho, he decides that he's going to pick him up and playfully, put him on. And it's when Corll sees this, Henley in his confession testifies that he did everything he could to dissuade Corll from killing Aguirre, but Corll would not be deterred. He bound and gagged Aguirre and afterwards sexually assaulted, tortured, and strangled the 18-year-old to death. Now, Henley claims not having any other option, which is complete horseshit, assisted Corll and Brooks with the burning of Aguirre at the High Island grave location. April 20th, 1 month later, Brooks, Henley, and Corll have their predatory sight on a mutual acquaintance of both boys, a 17-year-old named Mark Scott. And so they decided they're going to basically seize Mark by force. Mark fought with everything he had and even managed to reach for his knife and was about to stab Corll until he saw Henley point a loaded pistol at his head, at which point, according to Brooks, he just gave up. Defeated, Scott suffers through rape, torture, and is finally strangled to death and buried at the High Island site. Now, depending on whose version you hear, Henley depicts himself as sort of an unwilling accomplice. But if you ask Brooks about it, he would say that Henley was no unwilling participant. Brooks described Henley as being sadistic. And if you ask me, I don't really care for neither one of theirs opinion. They're both very sick individuals, and that's putting it lightly. And I'm doing my best to keep the episode as clean as possible, but it's hard not to get emotional with this story. In this next murder, you get a sense of who really Wayne Henley is. It's June 26, 1972, and the trio had just abducted two teenagers named Billy Balch and Johnny DeLone. In Brooks' account of this murder, he says the two boys were tied up to the torture board, raped and beaten. Henley then choked Balch to death and then shouted, "Hey, Johnny." When Johnny looked up, Henley shot him in the forehead with a small caliber bullet exiting through his ear. It wasn't over for Johnny yet. He was still alive and started to plead with Henley, crying out, "Wayne, please don't." Henley then strangled him to death after that. Both boys were buried at the High Island beach site. So I don't see why Brooks would have any reason to lie on Henley for. They're both going to prison for a very long time. I think they know that. And so I absolutely believe that he was telling the truth. This is who Henley was. And him trying to depict himself as some kind of unwilling participant or maybe even a hero, it didn't do him any good in the long run anyways. Both of them would spend the rest of their lives in prison. And his next murder attempt is an odd one. The trio, as usual, courses an unsuspecting 19-year-old named William Redinger to the house with the promise of having a party of some sort. It's here he's overtaken, tied to the torture board, he's raped and beat, and is about to be killed by Corll, but right before Brooks is able to convince Corll to let Redinger go, and he does. Now, as we've seen from previous accounts, Corll doesn't just let people go. So I have to ask the question, what really happened here? And if this Redinger was released, how come he didn't run straight to the cops? I mean, think of all the lives he would have saved if he just did that. How come he didn't tell his parents? And I found an interesting little piece of information on Reddit. And the only thing is that it's Reddit. So in order to validate, more research needs to be done on this, okay? But I'm going to put the link in the show notes for you so you can see. And the publisher's name was Gooseby Daily. And so we're going to refer to it as GBD. Okay, so GBD claims that there were documents found listing Redinger as a reference on one of Dean's apartment applications. GBD from Reddit also claims that Redinger's family had known the Corlls since the 60s. So their parents, maybe even the whole family, knew each other. Maybe they lived in the same town. GBD makes a claim that although Brooks and Henley were the two accomplices that were arrested, that it's believed Dean had another 3 boys working for him as well as procurers. And it's believed that Redinger is one of these boys, since he never got the police involved. And then the crazy part too is that it was documented that by photos that he was hanging out with him even after they supposedly tried to murder him, right? And all that will be on the website also. And it's the same thing with the case of Brooks and Henley. And both of them recounted that they were assaulted by Corll against their will. But guess what? They still stayed around. He wasn't like forcing them to stay in one area. One of them even moved away. And what they do, they came back the first chance they got. They came back and they started to work for him again. And so the storyline picks back up with Corll leaving Shula Street house. And he moves into an apartment called the Westcott Towers, which is only about 5 minutes away from the Heights neighborhood. And so it's summer, July 19th, 1972. And it doesn't take long for Corll to find his first two victims. The first is a 17-year-old Stephen Sickman, who was savagely bludgeoned to death around his face and chest area. But what he actually died from was strangulation. Sadly, only 1 month later, on August 21st, Roy Bunton, 19 years old, would fall victim to Corll. Roy was abducted while walking to work. Corll, who knocked him out and put him in the van, and then sexually assaulted him and then shot him in the head twice. Both boys were buried at Corll's boat storage location. The nature as to how these young men died was not uncovered until 2011, when they were finally exhumed and confirmed to be victims of Corll. Okay, so nobody knew what happened to them, and they didn't find out until 2011. And this is why they're saying that his body count is more than likely to be higher than what it actually is listed at, because this is just what they could find at the locations that they know of. Okay, so it's suggested that even before Brooks or Henley came into the picture, that he was working by himself. All right, so back to the story. In what seems to be Corll becoming ever so more brutal in his attacks, Brooks was describing his demeanor in one account as having a type of bloodlust. Like whenever he started getting real anxious, he said he started smoking cigarettes a lot, and he would be pacing around the room. He knew that it was going to be time for them to go on the hunt again. And so in the span from October 2nd, 1972 to November 1972, Corll would add an additional 4 more kills to his total. Jay Simiu, Richard Hembry, an 18-year-old that was unknown, and Richard Kipner. January 20th, 1973, Corll moves to a new address in Spring Branch, and he immediately finds a target with 17-year-old Joseph Lyles, and he was procured by both Brooks and Henley. Corll would not kill again for 5 months, possible due to a condition called hydrocele, which has to do with like a fluid buildup, and if it's not malignant, the conditions could go away on its own in 6 months to a year. His reign of terror was almost coming to an end, unknowingly to him. Corll goes on one of his most violent terrors ever. So now he's recovered from his condition. It's from June 4th to August 3rd. Corll, he would add another 8 young men to his list. And we'll read their names. And that's William Ray Lawrence, Tyler Blackburn, Homer Luis Garcia, John Sellers, Michael Balch, who happens to be the younger brother of Billy Balch, who was also killed by Corll, though this was at a separate time. This is heartbreaking that Michael, the younger brother, after his big brother disappeared, told his family, hey, I got to go find my brother. I'm sorry, I gotta leave home. I'll be back whenever I find out more information. And that was the last time they would see him alive. Charles Cobble and Marty Ray Jones. And last was James Stanton Dremala. That was his last victim. So now it's August 1973. Brooks had married his pregnant girlfriend back in July, so he was no longer working with Corll. On the night of August the 7th, Henley invited his friend, a 19-year-old named Timothy Cordell Curley. He invited him over to Corll's house for a party, he says. He says they would go there, they would sniff some pain and drink and smoke some weed. It would be great. Timothy accepts, but I mean, obviously, he don't know that he was intended to be Corll's next victim. But the boys, no, up until that point, they did as planned. They went to Corll's house. They partied till midnight. But for some reason, they decided that we're going to go somewhere. We got to go back to the Heights neighborhood, and they promised Corll that we're going to come back. Don't worry about it. So they leave. They make the run. They head back to the Heights neighborhood, and Curley parks close to around where Henley's house is. They go and do whatever it is that they were going to do. It's not documented what they did, but when they're about to leave, they're about to get back into their car, Henley hears something going on from across the street. And it's his 15-year-old friend named Rhonda Louise Williams. And she had just been beaten up by her dad, apparently, and was having trouble walking. So Henley says, okay, well, come with us then. Let's get out of here. And she accepts. So around 3 a.m., the three get back to Corll's house, and he is pissed. So he pulls Henley aside and he tells him that he ruined everything by bringing the girl to his house. And don't bother trying to make sense of that. I mean, because there's no reason. He's just a complete wacko, and that's it. So Corll starts making it seem like he calms down. And apparently Henley feels comfortable enough because the three teens, they start getting baked and they're sniffing pain, drinking, and Corll's just watching them. And after about 2 hours, their minds are probably mush right now, and they pass out. And Corll pounces on that opportunity. Henley recounts that he wakes up to Corll throwing handcuffs on him. His mouth is already taped, his feet and hands are bound, and he looks to his left and he sees Timothy and Rhonda, and they're already tied up as well, in the same position right next to them. Only Curley had been stripped of clothing. So when Corll notices Henley's awake, he removes his gag, and Henley instantly starts pleading with Corll. Though, to be honest, I don't think this was the first time that he had been in that situation with Corll. I think it's probably part of a sick game that they had. Because if you can remember earlier how Henley murdered Johnny Delone, I mean, he's just as sick as Corll, without a doubt. So Corll's whining, complaining about Henley bringing the girl, and he drags him to the kitchen, stands him up, puts a gun to his stomach, and he's about to shoot him, but he doesn't. Instead, they have a 30-minute conversation in which Henley is assuring Corll that everything's going to be okay, it's going to keep going like it was, and that he's personally going to help him take out Timothy and Rhonda. And Corll buys it. So he unties Henley, and the two take Rhonda and Timothy to the torture board, and they tie him up on opposing sides. And now at this point, Rhonda and Timothy are already awake, and they're freaking out, and they're crying, screaming, and Corll gives Henley a big hunting knife and tells him, okay, I'm going to take care of Curley, you take care of Rhonda. And so while Henley is cutting away Rhonda's clothing, he removes her gag at some point, and Rhonda lifts her head and looks into Henley's eyes and asking him a puzzling question, because she's out of it at this point. She says, Henley, is this for real? Henley reluctantly shakes his head. At this point, Timothy is already being assaulted, and Rhonda asks, "Are you going to do anything about this?" Henley looks up at Corll, and he asks Corll if he could take Rhonda into another room. He was probably going to let her go. Corll ignores the question, and he's already assaulting Curly. Henley looks over to his left, and he sees the gun on the table and an opportunity to put an end to this madness, and he takes it. Grabbing the gun, he aims it at Dean, screaming, "You've gone far enough, Dean." Corll gets off Timothy. As Henley continues to rant, he says, "I can't go on any longer. I can't have you killing all my friends." Corll, now approaching Henley, yells at him, "Well then kill me then, Wayne." Henley backs away as Corll closes the distance, and Corll screams, "You won't do it, will you?" Henley fires the .22 caliber pistol, smacking Corll right in the forehead. Although the bullet was too small to penetrate the skull, it bounces off. Corll again tries to grab Henley, and he fires 2 more shots, striking Corll in the left shoulder. Corll now tries to escape, leaving the room and running into the hallway outside. Henry advances in chase and fires 3 more shots, striking Corll in the lower back and upper shoulder. Corll slides down the wall head first and is dead in seconds. The monster is dead. His reign of terror is over. Henley unties Rhonda and Timothy and talk of what to do. Rhonda and Henley vote to just leave, but Timothy says that they should call the cops. Everyone agrees on this, and Henley borrows Corll's phone book to get the number for the Pasadena Police Department. Corll doesn't seem to mind this too much. Henley summons the police, and this night's scene ends with the 3 sitting together in the driveway. Henley, looking straight ahead off into the distance, blurts out, "If y'all weren't my friend, I could have got $200 for you." I'm so glad that this part of the story is over. This was super hard reading all these accounts and then having to write the show after that. It's hard not to tear up reading these accounts. And before I move into the failure of the HPD, the Houston Police Department at the time, I'll say this, that Henley was no hero. He was a sick, troubled individual who led people he knew to their murder for $200. His conscience simply caught up to him. And Rhonda and Timothy, they're lucky to escape with their lives. Now, I won't go into covering their court proceedings because there's nothing there. They're guilty. They know they're guilty. They were found guilty. And they received the punishment of someone who committed the acts that they did deserved. After police were led to the location of the burial sites and uncovered the horror there, the parents of the victims were pissed, and rightfully so. At the beginning of the show, I asked how could the police allow so many young men to go missing. The parents asked the same question, though I was very disappointed in the police chief. I was very disappointed in his answers. I found an article from 73, and I'll include that in the show notes. The police chief basically defended the effort, stating county lines and runaway protocols as his reason for lack of action. And my question is, what about treating parents of the missing children with disrespect when they would come into the police station to ask for updates? Was that part of the protocol too? To be an insincere a-hole? So Mr. Waldrop, the father of Donald and Jerry, stated in an interview that they would flat out told him, "What are you even doing here, sir? You know your kids are runaways." And he quoted them saying that. He stated that they pretty much treated him like an idiot and ran him out of there. So Houston had detectives at that point, and we're talking about the 70s. This ain't the 1800s. No one in that investigation found the amount of so-called runaways more than a coincidence. And before we conclude, the sad part is that this continues to be an issue to this day. A parent has a missing child, They report it to the police. The police tell them they have to wait 48 hours before they can file a report. This must change. 42 boys disappeared between 1970 and 1973 in the Houston area. It seems it's a real possibility that Corll's victims could have ranged far more than 28, but with him dead and David dying in prison from sickness in 2020, Henley would be the only one with that answer. But then again, he didn't join the two until 71, and it's possible Corll started his spree as early as 68. If you have any information about the young men that went missing between 1968 to 1973 in the Houston Heights area that may have been associated with Corll or had connections to the Corll Candy Company, please contact the show through email at info@spacecityxfiles.com. There was also one last unidentified known victim of Corll that has not been claimed by his relatives. He would have went missing at some point between 71 and 72 and is possibly from the Heights area. Judging by the attire he was found buried in, he was likely lost his life during the summer months, as he was found wearing a red, white, and blue swimming trunks, cowboy boots, a leather bracelet, and a long-sleeve khaki t-shirt with a handwritten message on it. The description is believed to read LB4MF or LBHM4 or L84MF. If you recognize any of this information, please contact us here at the show or the Houston Police Department Homicide Division. Lastly, January is Human Trafficking Awareness Month, so please do your best to know the signs of someone being trafficked or sexually abused. If you would like a refresher, there's a pinned post on our Instagram page that breaks it down really good. The only way we can change things is if we work together. Pledge this with me, please, now. If we see something, we say something. We won't turn our heads. We won't look away. Thank you for listening to this week's episode of the Space City X-Files. We appreciate you being here, and we look forward to being together with you again next Wednesday for the new episode. And it's a good one, folks. If you would like to support the show, there are now 3 ways. You can choose either one or all, but we appreciate it the same and love you no matter how you choose to support. 1, wherever you're listening, there should be a review button next or to around the show notes. Leave a quick reply and let us know how much you enjoyed yourself. Or 2, if you would like to become a certified member of the show, you can click on the Patreon tab at the top of our website. From there, it will take you to the Patreon page where you can become a member. And when you do, you get access to unreleased material, a Discord group from direct contact, and free merchandise. Lastly, number 3, if you would like to buy a drink or a bag of chips for any one of us, there's a support us with the tip tab at the top of the website, and there you can type in whatever amount you would like to give. Thank you again for all your support, especially with the best one of all, which is just having a good old listen to us. This is Rick with the Space City X-Files, and we'll see you on the next one.